Dry Creek wasn't known for storms, at least not the soaking kind. But when the wind began to push hard from the west that afternoon, carrying the smell of wet earth and far-off lightning, folks hurried to finish their errands. The giant cowboy was no different. He'd been loading a fresh sack of oats onto his roan when he spotted Mary Ellen hurrying across the street. Samuel bundled in her arms, her shawl whipping like a loose sail in the wind, by the time he stepped off the boardwalk. The first drops had begun to fall. She was headed toward the church, maybe thinking to wait it out there, but the sudden crack of thunder made Samuel jerk awake and wail. The sound was sharp and urgent. Slicing through the noise of the coming rain, Mary Ellen paused under the narrow overhang of the bakery, trying to soothe him. She bounced him gently, murmuring words the wind snatched away. But the baby was having none of it. His tiny fists flailed, his cries growing louder. She looked down at him, her own brow furrowed in worry, then glanced up as the giant cowboy. "Approach storms coming fast," he said, raising his voice just enough to carry over the wind. "I know," she replied, tightening the shawl around Samuel. "He's scared." The cowboy's eyes shifted to the baby. Samuel's cheeks were wet, not just from the rain now starting to mist in the air, but from the tears running down. Something in that sight, small, frightened, and clinging, made the big man's jaw tighten. Without asking, he extended his arms. Mary Ellen hesitated. It wasn't distrust exactly. She'd already seen him handle her boy with the gentleness of a man holding something sacred, but this was still unusual. The wind gusted again, harder this time, and she gave a small nod, transferring the bundle into his arms. The moment Samuel settled against him, the baby's cries softened. The cowboy's chest was broad and solid, his heartbeat steady under the layers of his shirt and vest. It was as if the boy recognized something: their safety, constancy, and in less than a minute, the wails faded into quiet whimpers, then into silence. Samuel's tiny hand clutched at a fold of his shirt, his head tucked beneath the brim of the man's hat. Shielded from the rain, they stayed that way under the awning, the storm swelling around them. Mary Ellen stood close, watching. She'd known men who were strong, men who could swing an axe or break a horse, but strength of that kind could be loud, careless even. What she saw now was something rarer, a kind of stillness that didn't need to prove itself. The giant cowboy didn't sway or rock. He simply stood there, letting the baby decide for himself that he was safe. It was such a simple thing, yet it struck her deeply. In his arms, Samuel looked even smaller than usual, a contrast so sharp it seemed almost unreal, like the image of a hawk sheltering a sparrow. And yet the boy slept utterly at peace, unaware of the reputation of the man who held him, unaware of the whispered stories that painted him as a figure to be feared or avoided. The rain came harder, drumming on the tin roof overhead. Across the street, a couple of townsfolk paused to watch. Old Mrs. Greeley, who had never been shy about voicing her opinions on strangers, narrowed her eyes but didn't say anything. The blacksmith, leaning on his doorway, let out a low chuckle, half in surprise, half in respect. Even the store clerk, stepping outside to pull in a barrel, glanced over and seemed to reassess something in his mind. The giant cowboy noticed the eyes on him, but didn't react. Let them look. He wasn't doing this for them. He wasn't even sure he was doing it for Mary Ellen. He was holding the boy because, in that moment, it felt like the right thing, maybe the only thing to do. The world out here was sharp-edged, and there were precious few moments when a man could be a shelter instead of a weapon. Mary Ellen, seeing the way her son had melted into sleep, allowed herself a rare exhale. "He doesn't sleep easily," she murmured, almost to herself. The cowboy glanced down at her. "He's sleeping now." "Yes," she said, her voice softer still. "On your chest." It was a strange thing to hear aloud, almost intimate in the way she said it. Not a declaration, not a question, but an observation that seemed to carry more weight than the words alone. The cowboy looked down at the small form against him, the rise and fall of the boy's breathing in time with his own. And for the briefest moment, he felt something shift deep inside. It wasn't sentimentality, not exactly. It was more like responsibility, a quiet acknowledgement that he could be trusted with something breakable. The rain began to ease, the edge of the storm passing. Samuel stirred, but didn't wake. Mary? Ellen stepped a little closer, adjusting the edge of the shawl to keep the chill from touching him. Her fingers brushed the cowboy's forearm in the processed, unplanned touch. Brief, but enough to make her realize how solid he was. Not just in size, but in presence. "You've got away with him," she said quietly. He shook his head slightly. "Just stood still long enough." She smiled faintly at that. Sometimes that's all it takes. When the last of the heavy drops faded into a soft drizzle, the cowboy shifted, careful not to jostle Samuel, and handed him back to her. The boy fussed briefly at the movement, then tucked himself against his mother's shoulder, still half asleep. Mary Ellen adjusted her hold, but the look she gave the cowboy lingered, a mix of gratitude and something she didn't have a name for yet. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, tipping his hat. "Keep him warm." As he stepped away, she watched him mount his roan, the great horse shifting under his weight, and ride off toward the open land beyond town. The sight stayed with her long after he disappeared into the gray horizon. She'd seen men carry babies before, but never like that. Never with the kind of patience that said there was no hurry, no task more important in that moment than being the thing another life could rest against. That evening, when the storm was only a memory and the town had gone quiet, talk began in the saloon. The blacksmith mentioned at first how he'd seen the giant cowboy holding the widow's baby, how the boy had gone from screaming to sleeping like he'd been wrapped in the calmest night air. The store clerk added that he'd never thought the man had that kind of softness in him. Even Mrs. Greeley, who prided herself on her skepticism, allowed that maybe he ain't all hard bone and shadow. But the giant cowboy wasn't in town. To hear it, he'd ridden back to his small cabin on the edge of the cottonwood grove, where the air still smelled of wet leaves. He unsaddled the roan, brushed him down, and sat for a long time on the porch with a mug of coffee, listening to the creek's swollen rush. His thoughts drifted back, uninvited, to the weight of that small body against his chest. The trust of it, the way the baby's breathing had matched his own. It wasn't the kind of thing a man could explain, not to others, and maybe not even to himself. Out here, in a land where survival meant keeping your edges sharp, the moment had been different. It was as if for a breath or two, the roughness of the world had held its distance, and he'd been allowed to stand in a space that was soft, unthreatened. Maybe that was why he didn't brush the memory aside. And somewhere in town, in a small rented shack lit by lamplight, Mary Ellen laid Samuel down to sleep. She thought about the way her son had gone quiet in the arms of a man she'd barely known, man the whole town whispered about. She thought about the steady heartbeat. Under that broad chest, the shield of his hat's brim against the rain. She told herself it was nothing, just an act of kindness from someone passing by. But she couldn't shake the image, neither could the town. And though no one said it outright, the story had already begun to grow in the retelling. By the weeks, and folks would say the baby had fallen asleep the moment the giant cowboy touched him. By the month's end, they'd claim the storm itself had quieted around them. Out here, legends didn't need truth, they only needed a good start. But for the two people at the heart of it, one, a woman with a baby to raise. The other, a man who thought his life was built only for solitude, wasn't a legend yet. It was just a moment. One they'd both remember, though neither would know just how much it would matter in the days to come. In a place like Dry Creek, people learned to survive on what little they had, and the women had it harder than most. There were widows, here plenty of them. The West had a way of making them, whether it was a stampede, a mining collapse, or a bullet that decided a man's fate before sunrise. But there was one in particular who folks whispered about when her back was turned. Her name was Mary Ellen Carver. She had come to Dry Creek 2 years earlier with her husband, a tall, red-haired prospector with a quick grin and a quicker hand at cards. The man had promised her they'd strike it rich in the nearby hills, but the gold they'd come searching for never showed, and one spring morning he rode out toward the Sierra foothills chasing another rumor. By sundown, word came back that he'd been found dead, thrown from his horse on the ridge road and trampled. Some said the horse spooked at a rattler. Others muttered about debts and unfriendly hands. The truth, as it often does, vanished in the dust. Mary Ellen was left with little more than a rented shack on the edge of town and the baby growing inside her. When the child came, small, pink-faced, and wailing, knit was in the dead of winter, with the wind rattling the shutters and a single candle burning in the room. She named the boy Samuel, after her father, and swore to herself that no matter how harsh this land could be, she'd see him grow strong enough to stand against it. Life for a widow with a baby was a balancing act between hunger and exhaustion. Mary Ellen took in sewing, mending the torn shirts and trousers of men who could afford to spend their wages in the saloon, but not on new clothes. She washed laundry in the icy creek until her hands turned raw. And when Samuel was old enough to crawl, she tied him into a blanket sling so she could keep working without letting him out of sight. The town had its share of kindness, but pity was thin on the ground. A few neighbors helped now and then, dropping off a loaf of bread, mending a roof shingle, but mostly folks kept to themselves. In Dry Creek, everyone was one bad season away from being desperate themselves. It was on a particularly hot afternoon, the kind where the sun turned the street dust to powder and the air shimmered over the rooftops, that the giant cowboy first noticed her. He had come into town for supplies, coffee, beans. A new length of rope hand was tying his roan outside the mercantile. When he heard the sound, it wasn't the usual crying of a hungry or fussy baby. This was a raw, hiccuping wail, the kind that clawed at a man's gut whether he liked it or not. He turned his head and saw her, Mary Ellen, kneeling beside a small wooden cart, one hand trying to soothe the child, the other clutching a coin purse so thin it looked like it held more air than money. The baby's face was red from crying, tiny fists balled tight. She rocked him gently, whispering, though the words were lost under the noise. From where he stood, the giant cowboy could see the shadows under her eyes, the tight set of her mouth. She was the kind of tired that came from more than lack of sleep, was the kind of tired that sank into your bones. He didn't know her story yet, but he didn't need to. In the West, a woman alone with a baby didn't need an introduction for her situation to be understood. She glanced up just for a moment, and their eyes met. Hers were a clear, deep brown, the kind of eyes that didn't flinch easily, but there was no denying the caution there. She looked at him the way most people did, measuring, wondering if he was trouble. He gave her the smallest nod, the kind that said he meant no harm, then stepped inside the store. Still, something about the scene stuck with him. Inside the mercantile, he gathered what he needed, but his mind kept circling back to the sound of that wail. Babies didn't cry like that for nothing. Hunger, sickness, or fear, one of those three was always behind it. And if it was hunger, well, hunger was a problem a man could solve when he stepped back outside. Mary Ellen was still there, now standing and rocking Samuel in her arms. The baby had quieted some, but his tiny whimpers carried on the air. The giant cowboy paused, his shadow stretching long across the boardwalk, and looked at them for a moment before speaking. "Hot day for the little one," he said, his voice low, almost gravelly from disuse. Mary Ellen blinked at him, startled that he'd addressed her at all. "It is," she replied cautiously. "But he's used to it. We don't have much choice." He glanced toward the cart. "You headed home." She nodded. "After I pick up a few things." He didn't ask what those things were, he could already guess. It's the same basic goods that kept a widow and baby going. Flour, maybe sugar, if she could afford it, lye soap, and whatever meat she could stretch the longest. But when she reached into her purse to pay the store clerk, it caught the way her fingers hesitated, the way she counted each coin twice. In Dry Creek, people noticed things. They just didn't always speak on them. But the giant cowboy was not. Like most people, without a word, he stepped past her, set a small cloth sack on the counter, and slid a silver dollar toward the clerk. "Add her things to mine," he said simply. Mary Ellen's head snapped toward him. "That's not necessary. Didn't say it was." He replied evenly, not looking at her. Just said to add it. The clerk, who'd learned better than to argue with a man who could block out the sun by standing in the doorway, nodded and began wrapping up her goods. Mary Ellen's lips tightened, and for a moment she looked like she might refuse outright. But then she glanced down at Samuel, who had drifted into a light doze against her shoulder, and swallowed her pride. "Thank you," she said softly. He tipped his hat. It's a small gesture that seemed to say, "Think nothing of it," and walked out with his own bundle. He didn't expect anything more to come of it, but over the next weeks their paths kept crossing. Once by the well, where she was hauling water with Samuel strapped to her back. Another time outside the small church, where she sat on the steps, trying to quiet him while the preacher spoke inside. Each time, the giant cowboy found himself slowing down, offering a word or two, sometimes nothing at all. Just a nod that passed between them like an understanding. The turning point came one evening when the wind picked up and the smell of rain swept into town. He'd been heading out, supplies loaded in his saddlebag, when he saw her again, this time standing in the street, clutching Samuel close, staring at a wagon wheel that had come loose and rolled into a ditch. Our cart leaned awkwardly to one side, the axle bent. She was trying to lift it enough to wedge a stone underneath, but the thing wouldn't budge. Without speaking, he stepped forward, took the wheel in one hand, and lifted the cart with the other. She stared up at him, stunned by the ease with which he did it, and quickly rolled the wheel back into place. He held the cart steady while she set the pin and straightened the axle. When it was done, she murmured, "I can't pay you for her." He shook his head. Didn't ask, she hesitated, then offered something else. "Would you like to hold him?" The question caught him off guard. He'd been handed reins, rifles, branding irons, but never a baby. For a long moment, he simply looked at Samuel, whose wide blue eyes studied him in return. Finally, he nodded. Mary Ellen shifted the baby into his arms. It was an odd thing. In his hands, the boy felt impossibly small, his whole body fitting between the giant cowboy's palms and forearms, like he'd been carved out of air. Samuel stared up at him for a heartbeat, then, with the trust only a child can give, settled his head against the man's chest and closed his eyes. Something in that moment shifted. The street was still there, the dust, the wind, the creak of the saloon sign, but it all faded to the edges. The giant cowboy, who had faced down men with rifles in storms that could strip flesh from bone, stood perfectly still, feeling the faint, steady rise and fall of the baby's breath against him. Mary Ellen watched, and for the first time since they'd met, her guarded expression softened. She saw what few ever did, the man beneath the sighs and the silence, a man who could be trusted, not because he said so, but because of the way he held her child, though nothing else in the world mattered just then, and that was how it began. The first time folks in Dry Creek laid eyes on him, the whole town seemed to slow to a stop. Dust hung in the air that morning, stirred up from the relentless prairie wind that rolled in from the west. But when he came riding down the main street, even the wind seemed to pause almost as if it wanted a better look. He sat atop a big roan gelding that, on any other day, might have looked impressive enough to draw stares on its own. But under him, the horse looked almost small, as if it had been shrunk in the saddle. The man's knees rose well above the stirrups, and the saddle creaked under his weight. His boots, scuffed and caked in the red dirt of the open range, hung low enough that the toes nearly brushed the dust. Nobody knew his real name then. Names in a place like Dry Creek mattered less than reputations, and reputations here were born from stories, most of them exaggerated before the second telling. Someone whispered that he'd once lifted a full barrel of water over his head just to make room in a wagon. Another swore they'd seen him carry a broken-down mule nearly a mile to the nearest stream. But what really sealed his legend wasn't just what he could lift or carry. 'Twas the way he filled a doorway, blocking the light like a barn wall, and the way conversations went quiet when he stepped into a room. Even his hat seemed oversized, wide-brimmed, and sweat-stained, pulled low over a face weathered by sun, wind, and years most men couldn't have survived. His jaw was square, the kind you'd expect from a man who never shied from a fight. A week's worth of dark stubble clung to his face, though no one was sure if that was from neglect or simply his way of saying shaving was for smaller men with softer lives. His eyes, gray, cold as the winter river, were the kind that saw more than they let on. They could measure a man in a glance, weigh him, and decide if he was worth a word or just a nod. The nickname Giant Cowboy started in whispers. The first folks to use it were the stable hands, sang it with a half-smile when describing the stranger who had to stoop to get through the barn door. Then the barkeep took it up after watching the man drink a full glass of whiskey in one swallow, set it down without a sound, and leave the saloon as quietly as he'd entered. Before long, the name was passed along like a coin changing hands, until even the children playing stickball in the dusty alleyways knew who the Giant Cowboy was. But names aren't given without reason, and this one had roots deeper than mere size. He'd had the kind of presence that could calm a skittish horse just by walking into the corral. Men who'd known violence real, bare-knuckle, gunsmoke violence could tell by the way he moved that he had been close to it before, perhaps too many times. There was no wasted motion in him. Every step was measured, every turn deliberate. His hands were huge, scarred from years of rope burns and knife work. Yet when he tied a lead rope, the knot sat neat as a schoolmarm's handwriting. That quiet precision unnerved people more than if he'd been loud or quick to anger. It was the stillness of a predator, one who didn't need to prove himself, because he already knew exactly what he could do. Some said he'd worked cattle drives all the way from Texas to Montana, moving herds so vast they looked like dark rivers across the plains. Others swore he'd ridden with lawmen, tracking down the kind of outlaws whose names still made bank tellers double-check their locks. But the Giant Cowboy never confirmed any of it. When folks asked, he'd just shrugged, maybe, give a half-smile, and say, "I've been here and there." That was all. And somehow that made him more of a mystery. Clothing didn't disguise his size, it advertised it. His coat, when he wore it, was a dark oilskin duster that swept nearly to his boots. In the cold, he favored a thick wool vest over a faded red shirt, the kind that looked like it had weathered more winters than the town itself. His gun belt hung low, not for show, but because that's where it rested comfortably on his frame. The Colt at his hip was worn smooth at the grip, not from polishing, but from years of being exactly where it needed to be. Some men carry a gun because they think it makes them dangerous. The Giant Cowboy carried one because it was simply another tool in his life, a life where tools were used only when necessary. Children at first were afraid of him. When he'd walk by, their games would pause and they'd stare, clutching sticks like swords. unsure whether to challenge him or just gape. But after a while, they realized he wasn't unfriendly, just quiet. Once, a boy dropped his toy horse in the street, and the giant cowboy, without a word, stooped, picked it up between fingers that could crush a man's windpipe, and handed it back with surprising gentleness. The boy never forgot it. Men sized him up out of instinct, as men in the West often did when another stranger rode into town. Some were quick to judge, thinking size alone meant slow reflexes. Those who made the mistake of testing him didn't. Repeat it. There was that incident with Harlan Pike, the blacksmith, who thought his own shoulders were the broadest in the territory. The two had an arm wrestling match one Saturday night in the saloon, with the whole town crowded around the table. It ended in less than 3 seconds, the giant cowboy lowering Harlan's arm to the wood as if he were simply setting down a cup of coffee. He didn't smile, didn't gloat, just nodded once and walked away, leaving the room buzzing with talk. But strength alone doesn't make a legend. It was the way he carried himself, like a man who'd seen too much, done too much, and was just trying to find a place where the land was wide enough and the nights quiet enough to let him rest. The plains have a way of humbling men, grinding down their edges until only the core remains. For the giant cowboy, that core seemed to be forged from something tougher than steel. Still, there were rumors. There always are. Some said he'd once been married, and that his wife and child had been taken in a raid while he was away driving cattle. Others claimed he'd been an outlaw himself, riding under a different name, until something, maybe conscience, maybe tragedy, had driven him to hang up his bandana and turn to honest work. No one knew the truth, and no one dared press him for it. People learned quickly in Dry Creek that you didn't push the giant cowboy unless you wanted to find out just how quick those massive hands could draw a colt, and yet, for all his size and silence, there was something about him that drew people in. Maybe it was the way he listened when others spoke, giving them the full weight of his attention. Maybe it was the rare moments like when he'd tip his hat to an old widow crossing the street, or carry a sack of flour for the storekeep's wife that reminded folks he wasn't just a wall of muscle and shadow. Beneath the legend, there was a man, and that man seemed to live by a simple code. Do what needs doing, don't talk about it, and leave the bragging to others. The nickname stuck because no other name fit. He was the giant cowboy, and in a land where men came and went with the seasons, he was the kind you remembered, not just for what he could do, but for the quiet certainty that if you were in trouble, real trouble, he was the one you'd want riding up alongside you. No one knew then that his path would cross with a widow and her child, or that the hardest man in Dry Creek would one day be found sitting still, a tiny infant asleep against his chest. But that was the thing about the giant cowboy: just when you thought you had him figured, he'd show you something that didn't fit the story at all.